So we are in chapter 30, verse 25, and through the end of the chapter, that's the first section, and then 31 through 16 will be the second section. So I'm actually just going to read the first section, and we'll talk through it first, and then once we finish that, I'll read the second section. I have a reason for that will become apparent here in a few moments, right? So chapter 30, and beginning in verse 25. As soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go, for you know the service that I have given you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it." Jacob said to him, "You yourself know how I have served you, and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also?" He said, "What shall I give you?" Jacob said, "You shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later when you come to look into my wages with you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen." Laban said, "Good, let it be as you have said." But that day, Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flock. Then Jacob took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees, and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred, when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped, and all the black in the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. All right, so the story of Jacob continues to be filled with intrigue and deception and all sorts of trickery and interesting things that happen in this narrative as well. But we're going to see that there's some very clear purposes of God in this that become apparent in the second section that we're going to look at in a moment in chapter 31. But I wanted to just lay out the narrative first so we can really walk through it as the original audience would have hearing this. I want us to feel the tension here that a person reading this for the first time would feel in this narrative, which is exactly what God ultimately wants us to feel. And then we find the resolution in that second section. So Jacob decides here at the beginning of this section, it's time to leave. And maybe the first question that might come to our mind is, why at this point now is Jacob determined to leave? What do you think? Why, and right here in verse 25, Jacob says, "Okay, it's time for me to go." Why would he have this inclination here at the beginning of this section?
Rachel.
Okay, so Rachel has Joseph. Okay, so that there may be part of that. He's waiting for her to bear a son so that he has sort of a that solidified before he leaves her father. Good, that's definitely part of it. What else do you think?
Here to get back to his.
Okay, so ultimately he's got to get back to his inheritance from his father. Of course, he doesn't quite know what he's going back to, so that might also account for the reason that he's spent so much time already here and not gone back yet, because he's worried about Esau. He doesn't know what's going to happen, and we're gonna find out in the coming narratives. But ultimately, that's his land, and his inheritance is there, and he's got to go back. But why now? I mean, it might be partially because Rachel clearly the text tells us as soon as Rachel bore Joseph, so there's definitely something there. Why does he want to leave? Okay. Yeah, so the time period is finished. We're going to see that in a little bit, and actually later, not even in this section, he's explicit with Laban. I've served you for 14 years, 7 for Leah, 7 for Rachel, and then we're going to see here he serves another 6 with, the text that we read just a moment ago. It kind of breezes by. You might think this happened quickly, but it doesn't. It's another 6 years. He's probably, he distrusts Laban. We're going to find out in the next passage that over the period of this, of the 7 + 7, and then now another 6 years, Laban changes his wages 10 different times. Obviously, he's been tricked over and over again, and now he's going to be tricked again in this text. So he doesn't trust Laban. Really, Jacob has been sort of a hired hand up to this point. He's just worked for his wives, and as he's clear in this text, he gained 2 wives, actually 4 through this, but he hasn't really built up his own wealth to take care of his own family. And once again, we see Jacob's good character in this text. We've seen a lot of growth in Jacob. Obviously, he was sinful and deceptive with Esau and with his father. But we saw, the text we looked at last week does paint Jacob in a pretty bad light. He's very angry with Rachel. He's very passive. He doesn't take the leadership that he ought to. But the passage previous to that and this passage both paint Jacob in a very good light. It appears that the whole issue with the wives and the sons and the infighting and all of that, and then the two handmaidens becoming wives, was a weakness. It was a sin. It was a problem for Jacob, but it was sort of an aberrance compared to these other decisions that he's making, which just once again reiterates what we ended with last week, and that is how bad polygamy is. Here is a man who has experienced a lot of spiritual growth. He's making a lot of good decisions, and he does so here as well in this section. But because he has 2 wives and then 3 wives and then 4 wives, that just leads to a lot of problems in and of itself. And it just once again reiterates the fact that polygamy is so terrible. So he decides, okay, now we're ready to go back into the promised land, and he approaches Laban about that. And think again from the perspective of the original Israelites who are reading this. They've just heard the account of the birth of their forefathers. Everybody but Benjamin is now alive. All of the 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you're an Israelite, what does that communicate to you that might give you hope when you're about to cross over the Jordan and go inherit the land?
Here's family, the tribes that are remaining, taking land, leaving with riches.
Okay. Yep.
Which is exactly what happened to Egypt.
Yep, exactly. And think about it this way too. How many of the people who are about to cross over in the promised land were born in the promised land? None of them, right? They were all born either, well, most of them, a vast majority of them were born in the wilderness. And then you have Joshua and Caleb who were born in Egypt, and then Moses, but he's going to die. But most of them had been born in the wilderness. They had not been born in the promised land. And here they're reminded of the fact that this was also true of their forefathers. Isaac and Jacob were born in the promised land, but none of the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. And now they're ready to go back into the promised land. And so there's an identification with their forefathers here that is, again, hopefully going to strengthen them and give them hope and confidence as they go back into the promised land. So Jacob approaches Laban with this intent to go back. But Laban, of course, recognizes that that he had benefited quite a bit from Jacob's time with his flock. In fact, it appears very clearly in this text that Jacob had become really a master tender of flocks. He knew what he was doing. And because of that, Laban had really, really increased in wealth. In fact, Jacob himself says, before I came, verse 30, you didn't have much. And now, after I've worked for you for this many years, you're a wealthy man. And Laban acknowledges that, right? In verse 27, he says, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord, Yahweh, has blessed me because of you. So what do you think that means? What is he referring to here with divination? I have learned by divination. What do you think? Okay, yeah. There's a little bit of debate as to what exactly this means. Some try to soften this. The Hebrew here could also just mean something more broadly like I became rich or something like that. But most Old Testament scholars don't want to do that because there really is the terminology really does connote this idea of determining something through divination. But remember again who we're talking about. Laban is a pagan, right? Did he discover this by divination that the wealth came from Jacob? Well, no, but it was fairly obvious, right? It's fairly obvious that it was Jacob's intelligence, Jacob's hard work, Jacob's, years of working for Laban that resulted in the wealth. And he's just a pagan, trying to read the signs and trying to attribute this knowledge to a false god, to divination. And yet he's right. And he even attributes it to the God of Jacob. Yahweh has blessed me because of you. So he's not wrong. And yet we're going to see he's certainly not a follower of Yahweh in this text. He's simply trying to get more out of Jacob, to get more wealth before Jacob leaves. So he asks Jacob, what will I give you? And Jacob's response, his plan, really shows his good character. Jacob has clearly grown. He has clearly changed from the man that he was when he deceived his brother and when he deceived his father. I mean, just think about this plan that he proposed before his father-in-law, right? He tells him, let me pass through your flocks, and I'm going to remove every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and same among the goats, and those will be my wages. What about that particular plan really shows a good character in Jacob? Okay, he's taking the less desirable stuff, right? It's a modest proposal. He's not like, hey, I've worked for you this long, you're wealthy because of me, give me the cream off of the top. He really maybe could have demanded that, but it really showed his good character that he says, you know what, I'm just going to take the less desirable, the spotted stuff, the striped stuff, the black lambs, not the sheep lamb, or not the white lambs. So he's taking the more modest flock for his wages. And what else shows good character in this plan that he has proposed for Laban? What's that? Yeah, it's very honest, right? He says, you come check, and if I have anything besides what I've said, you'll be able to clearly see. And so he's really showing some very good character. We've seen a lot of growth in Jacob, and he's trying to do what's right. And yet, of course, he does, even his request, what are you going to give me? Clearly wasn't a selfish request. He's not just out for wealth for himself. He says very clearly, what's his motivation for wanting to have some wages after all of this work? What's his prime motivation? What does he say? What's that? He needs to take care of his family, which is a noble duty. That is his responsibility. He recognizes now, having worked this long, I've got nothing to show for it. And if I leave now, I'm not going to be able to provide for my family. Remember, he's been given the inheritance back home, but he doesn't know if he's actually going to get it because he doesn't know if Esau is still out to get him or what. So he wants to take care of his family. That's a noble desire, and that's exactly what is motivating his actions here in this text. So Jacob has experienced much growth during this time, Has Laban experienced any growth? Clearly not. I mean, you can almost picture kind of this used car salesman sort of, conniving person, which, as we've talked about the last several weeks, is in the providence of God due payment for Jacob's own deception previously. I mean, the contrast here, God has a sense of humor. God often pays us or, chastens us with exactly what we have done, which is exactly what he's doing with Jacob. Jacob has grown from that used car salesman deception. Laban, on the other hand, has not. So from the very beginning, what will I give you? You can see the wheels turning in his mind. He's trying to think, what else can I get out of him before he leaves? And so he's probably, clearly, not even probably, it's clear by his response here in verse 34. He's very pleased with this proposal. In and of itself, it's a good proposal for him. He's not having to give up any of the best, and he can check to make sure Jacob's not lying. But again, right when he's saying, good, let it be as you have said, he's already thinking in his mind, I've got it. I can go and I can take out all of these speckled and spotted and black sheep and goats and make sure that Jacob gets none of that. So he's cheating, he's deceiving, and he had no reason to do this other than his own selfish ambition. He had wealth now. He was very well off. Jacob wasn't to do this. He's simply being vindictive and looking out for himself. And yet, in and through this, in the providence of God, God is demonstrating his care and his love and his protection for Jacob. And we see that very clearly in the text. And what we also see, I think, interestingly, is, Jacob's deceptive nature, which was predicted when he was born, right? When he was coming out grasping the heel of Esau. So that was his character, he's inclined toward this sort of thing. He uses that for evil in his deception of Esau, his trickery of Esau, and then his deception of Isaac. But then his spiritual growth doesn't necessarily change his natural inclinations, but rather it changes how he uses those natural inclinations, right? He uses those in a deceptive way with Esau and with Isaac, but now he's turning that sort of deceptive, manipulative nature into a resourceful nature. So he's stuck. He's looking at all the flocks, and none of what he committed to taking is there. So he becomes very resourceful. He decides, well, I'm going to use what I know, and I'm not going to be deceptive. I'm not going to trick Laban. I'm going to use my skills as a herdsman, and I am going to make sure that I get at least something. He clearly knows something about selective breeding, right? He knows how to pair animals to get the best and the strongest when it comes to the breeding of animals. And again, this text that we read this morning, although it passes by fairly quickly, this takes another 6 years of breeding in order to get the flock that he eventually leaves with. In chapter 31, verse 41, Jacob says, these 20 years I have been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters, right? 7 for Leah, then he marries them both, and then 7 now for Rachel, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. So he's been there for 20 years, and 6 of those years is this breeding process where he is using what he knows, his own resourcefulness, to get something and not be left without any flocks whatsoever. And that's an important lesson, I think, for us to recognize. Sometimes people excuse sin because, well, that's just how God made me. I was born with certain inclinations, certain character qualities. That's how God made me, so I can't help it, and that's why I'm sinning. And in one sense, there's truth that God makes us often with certain inclinations, but that doesn't excuse the sinful practice of those inclinations, right? So sometimes God makes us, God makes some people have more of a passive disposition. God makes some people with more of an aggressive disposition. Okay, both of those are how God creates us. It's just who we are, but we can allow that to lead us into sin, or we can allow that to lead us into using our natural disposition for righteousness. A more passive kind of person, more introverted person maybe, could sin through that by saying, well, I'm introverted, so I'm just not going to serve the body. I'm just not going to care about people. I'm not going to stand up for truth. I'm not going to be a leader in my home because that's just how God made me. I'm more passive, right? That would be a sinful application of just naturally who I am. Or we can fight against that and do what's right, stand for truth, be leaders, not be passive, but use that natural inclination to be an encouragement. People who are more passive, more introverted tend to naturally be encouraging people, right? We can use the natural inclinations that we were created with to be a blessing. On the other hand, some people are born more aggressive, and that could be used in a sinful way, right? I'm aggressive in a way that is bombastic and that harms other people, and I'm just a bull in a china shop kind of personality, and that's just who I am. I can't help it. Or we can recognize, yes, that's how God made me, so I'm going to use that to really be bold and stand for truth and protect those who are vulnerable. And we can use the natural inclinations that God has created us with for good and not for evil. And I think that's what we see here with Jacob. He's sort of I'm trying to think of a word that doesn't have a negative connotation. Conniving is the wrong word because that has a negative connotation, but he's the kind of person who strategizes and thinks, okay, what can I arrange in order to achieve, good results? He used that for evil with Esau. He uses that for evil with Isaac, but now he's using that natural inclination and ability for good in his knowledge of selective breeding. Okay, but what's the natural question here with all of this narrative about the selective breeding? What's the question that immediately comes to your mind? Yeah, what's the deal with the sticks, right? I mean, what is going on here with the peeling of the sticks and and there's all sorts of theories about, maybe he knew that certain plants had certain fertility powers, and maybe there was some sort of there's all sorts of theories that people try to come up with what may have been behind this. But what I would suggest is that we have to interpret what's going on here with the sticks in light of what comes next in the text in chapter 31. I think Moses, again, a master storyteller, is deliberately setting up this narrative to make us feel exactly what we're feeling. Like, all right, you're mad at Laban, and then you're happy for what happens with Jacob, and then you go, how did that work? Right? I think Moses wants us to feel this. He wants us to feel frustrated for Jacob, and he wants us to feel like we've got no explanation for how this actually happened. But now in chapter 31, Moses is going to explain what's behind all of this. Because who is missing in this first section that we just read? Who's missing in the narrative? God. Laban does give God credit. It's because of your God that this all happened, and Jacob gives Yahweh credit for this. But we don't see God acting in this first section. It seems like Jacob took things into his own hands, and I've painted it in a very positive light, but I'm sort of doing that because of what's going to happen in 31. We might come to the conclusion here is Jacob again taking matters in his own hands and being manipulative and being deceptive in how he's selectively breeding. But the God-inspired interpretation of what we just read appears now in chapter 31. So let's look at chapter 31 in the first 16 verses. Now, Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's, he has gained all this wealth. And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where the flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me with the favor as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said, the spotted shall be your wages, then all the flock bore spotted. And if he said, the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. In the breeding season of the flock, I lifted up my eyes and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in a dream, Jacob, and I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see. All the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there any portion of or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do. So here we have the explanation for everything that has happened in the previous section. Was God absent or inactive in all that we read in the first section at the end of chapter 30? No, in fact, the real explanation of the whole thing is that the Lord himself had appeared to Jacob and had given him instructions. Jacob is doing what God told him to do. We find in verse 10 that God had given Jacob a dream, and that dream is what led to everything that happened in the narrative. The angel of the Lord has spoken to Jacob in that dream. We find that angel of the Lord, this is a very clear instance in which the angel of the Lord is a theophany. It is God himself, because the angel of the Lord says, I am the God of Bethel, right? So this is not just any angel. This is probably the second person of the Trinity, a Christophany in visible form. And so God is the one who told Jacob to leave. And it is God who provided for Jacob. It is God who provided for the needs of Jacob to take care of his family. And notice in particular, I mean, so much of the language that God uses in instructing Jacob is so striking. For example, in verse 3, the Lord says to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers. Now pause there for a moment. What is so striking about that statement? Return to the land of your fathers.
His father wasn't fathers.
Okay. Fathers, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say his father didn't own from him.
Okay, they didn't actually own any land. Yeah. And think about that phrase, like the land of your fathers. To what does that usually refer? What's that?
Wording in that when Jacob was at Bethel,
Okay.
God made the same promise to Jacob that he made to Abraham. It's kind of almost the same exact.
So covenantal language, the God of your father, Abraham and Isaac, that kind of thing too. Yeah. So I think what we have going on here is sort of a tension between, yes, this is clearly a reference to the promised land. It's a reference to Abraham and Isaac. It's a reference to the covenant, but yet they don't own anything yet except for a little burial plot. And when in this culture you would refer to the land of your fathers, you usually were referring to like your ancestors and your forefathers. Like not just your father and your grandfather. That's a little too close in lineage. Like the land of my fathers is where my ancestors are from. Well, where's that? Well, where he is now, right? So to say the land of your fathers would mean where he is dwelling right now. I mean, this is the land that Abraham's family came from, and Sarah's family came from, and Rebekah's family came from. And yet God is God is redefining for Jacob what the land of his fathers really is. And in fact, this is the first time in all of Scripture that Canaan, the promised land, is referred with this language, the land of your fathers. God has never described the land this way before. Usually the land of your fathers meant back in Haran, back where you came from. But now for the first time, God is describing the promised land. He's describing the land of Canaan as the land of your fathers. Jacob, through this 20 years, is now forced to feel very separated from his ancestors and his wife's ancestors, where he might be tempted to stay. Well, this is the land of my forefathers. My wife's family is here. You know, that's a natural thing for a man to say. You know, my wife's family is here, so we're going to stay, right? And yet God wants him to go back. God commanded him to go back. And so, you know, sometimes we might wonder, why does God do these difficult things? Why did God put Jacob through this 20 years of torture and deception? Well, part of it is because he needed to be taught these lessons, and we've seen some spiritual growth in Jacob because of it. But part of it is that God used this to completely separate Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from their kindred, from their ancestors, from their forefathers. They have now established a new kindred, a new family, a new homeland. And again, remember what encouragement this would be for Israel. I mean, they've been nomads for 40 years. They were captives in Egypt for years before that. They have not been in their promised land since Jacob, right? Jacob's going to go back. He's going to be there for a while, but they all know in their minds it's Jacob and his sons that end up going to Egypt in the first place. They've not experienced the promised land. And yet they're reminded in this very language of God's revelation to Jacob that they have a homeland. This is the land of their fathers. This is the land of their kindred. This is the land where Abraham and Sarah are buried, and where Isaac and Rebekah are going to be buried, and where Israel is now thinking with confidence and hope, will one day be buried too. And what does God continue to say there in verse 3? Return to the land of your fathers and your kindred, and I will be with you. Right? This is the promise. This is the promise that God had given to Jacob at Bethel in chapter 28. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised to you. God gave Jacob that promise at Bethel. He's now been 20 years outside of the promised land. And now God is coming and he's once again reiterating the promise that he had established in Bethel. And he's saying, I'm going to continue to be with you. And I'm going to fulfill these promises that I have given to you. Jacob, it seems clear, knows this. I mean, when he was given that promise back at Bethel, if you remember, he has sort of what seems to be a conversion moment, and he covenants with God, and he says, I will obey you, I will follow you. And it seems like he has done that. He has the snafu with the wives, and that's a big problem. But for the most part, he acts nobly and righteously while he's with Laban. He's evidenced that in this very text. So he's confident, he's ready to go. He knows God will be with him. But who might need a little convincing of this? His wives, right? Which is exactly why then Jacob in verse 4 sends for Rachel and Leah. Notice he tells them to come into the field where his flock was. Why does he do that?
See.
What's that? Okay, that's a good point, right? Maybe so that they can see with their eyes the fruit of what has happened. But he also wants to get them away from who? Laban, right? And it appears at the beginning of this chapter, even the sons of Laban are starting to get a little testy with this. And he wants his wives to know the truth. He wants to convince them to leave with him, that this is the right decision. And how does he do this? Well, notice how many times in this narrative the word father appears. Notice he says in verse 5, your father does not regard me with favor as he did before. And what's the contrasting statement? But the God of my father has been with me. He wants them to feel the tension. Notice what your father has done, and notice what the God of my father has done for us, right? Verse 7, your father cheated me and changed my wages 10 times, but God, the implication here, the God of my father, did not permit him to harm me. Verse 8, your father changed the terms, right? Changed my wages 10 times, but the God of my father gave me the herds. The God of my father has been with me. God did not permit him to harm me. And so he's trying to communicate to his wives what he now, it doesn't seem like he ever wavered on this. He was just faithful, but he knows with confidence the God of my fathers is with me. I have promised myself and covenanted myself with God, and now I need to go and do what God told me to do. He told me to go back to the land, and he's trying to help his wives see the same thing. You might be comfortable here. You might not want to leave your father, but I want you to see your father for who he is, in contrast to the God of my fathers, who has made me promises and who has kept his promises to me. God did not permit your father to harm us, me, but us by extension. God has given me the herds. And then he tells them what really is the key to the whole passage. And that is that God had appeared to him in a dream during the breeding season. The whole stick thing, that was God's idea. That wasn't just Jacob conniving. Now, clearly, Jacob did apply his knowledge of selective breeding in the whole process. He knew that, the stronger ones need to be here at the right time so that they'll mate and then they'll have the strong ones. He knew that. He knew to take the spotted and mate them with the strong ones. So he does have a place in this. But it was God who had told Jacob to do the whole thing with the sticks, which I think leads to the conclusion that the sticks had nothing to do with what happened. Like, can you think of any other stories in the Bible where somebody had to do something like really out of the ordinary, like God told them do this and then you'll receive what you're looking for, and it really wasn't what they had to do that accomplished the end. It was God, but they still had to do something weird. Can you think of anything like that?
Please.
Okay, the fleece. Naaman is a really good example. Was it really dipping in the water 7 times that healed Naaman? Okay, that's another great example.
Is it possible that it's simply that there can also be like a temporal explanation?
Could be.
Not
Yeah.
that what God showed him isn't actually like, because I think Naaman's example is obvious, like it doesn't matter how many times you live.
Right.
But like, could there not be?
It could be. My only pause there is I would think if there were, that's the correct subjunctive, that in our modern scientific era, we would know what that is, right? And there's some guesses and there's some maybes, but there's no like, well, we know now that certain tree, that if you peeled it, blah, 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 there's no actual scientific explanation. So it could be that we just don't know, and there could be a scientific explanation. Either way, I think it's more similar to walking around Jericho 7 times is a perfect example. Was there anything about walking around the city 7 times that actually achieved the walls coming down? I've actually heard some people say, like, the acoustics of the trumpets at that moment vibrated just right and knocked the walls down, right? Was there anything about dipping in the river 7 times, not 6, because remember, Naaman tried just once and then twice, 7 times, boom, his leprosy is gone. Was there anything about it? No. So why does God sometimes have us do unexplainable things in order to achieve what we are requesting of him? Why does he have us do that? To test our faith, right? This was a test of Jacob's faith. This really was the final test to see if Jacob had learned. Is Jacob going to try to manipulate things and take things into his own hands, or is he going to trust me? Jacob, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to take care of you. You need to trust me. Okay, so you've been tricked. Here's what I want you to do. Peel these sticks, blah, blah, blah. And Jacob, again, with his own knowledge, is probably like, do what? But he does it. And then he also uses his knowledge of selective breeding And God blesses him through this. The sticks did not cause the miracle. The sticks were evidence of Jacob's faith and revealed that yes, indeed, this is a man who truly fears the Lord. He is obeying the Lord. Other than the bad section on the polygamy stuff, Jacob is evidencing true faith in God, and now he's ready to obey the Lord. Barbara.
Didn't believe it. Proof of God's power.
Yeah,
They could see God can do this.
that's right. Yeah, and this is particularly important for the wives, right? He's trying to exactly communicate that to his wives to say, listen, this is God. This is the God of my father who has given us all this wealth. There's no explanation for this. And so I want you to trust in the God of my father. And so that's exactly what God is saying in the dream. God is communicating once again. I want you to go back to the land of your kindred. I am the God of Bethel. Remember the importance of that location, house of God, where Jacob anoints that pillar, makes a vow to him. And so what is Rachel and Leah's response? Are they convinced by all of this? They are. They recognize we've got nothing here anymore. They recognize the deception of their father to the degree that they're like, he's not really even our father anymore. We have nothing. In fact, how do they describe themselves in verse 15? Are not we regarded by him as foreigners? I mean, isn't that remarkable? Here are two daughters who are born in Haran, born to Laban, and they feel like foreigners in their own land. They're now, by God's grace and because of his providence and what he has done, they're feeling the pull to a new homeland, which is exactly what God desires. This is what God has arranged. God has arranged through these circumstances, through these painful circumstances, God has arranged them to feel like this world is not my home. I want to go to the true homeland, which is what God intended. And this is, of course, what God intends for husbands and wives. Leave father and mother, you become one flesh, and they're now recognizing this. All of this has been part of God's plan. All of this has been to show that Jacob's wealth did not come from his conniving, it came from the power of God. All of this has been designed in order to make Jacob, who doesn't seem like he needs a lot of convincing, but especially the wives who probably did need a convincing, to make them know in their very soul, this is not our home. We want to go to our true homeland. And so Moses's words in verse 43 of chapter 30 are reiterated again in this section. So in chapter 30, verse 43, he says, thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks and female servants and male servants and camels and donkeys. Well, that language sounds very much like how God described Abraham's wealth in chapter 12, how God described Isaac's wealth in chapter 26. God has clearly been with him, and now he wants him to go back to the land. And again, this would have been encouragement for the Israelites, but this ought to be encouragement for us. Why does God put us through painful, sometimes, trials and testing in our lives? Well, there's many different reasons. Sometimes it is to teach us lessons in order to sanctify us. Jacob needed that. But many times God puts us through painful trials, physical pain, pain with our own sin or pain with the sin of those we love, things happening in our culture, what our country's going down the tubes, all of that. Why does God do that? Well, sometimes he does that so that we remember this is not our home, right? We are longing for the land of our fathers. We are longing for the land of our kindred, which is the presence of God himself. That doesn't mean that God has not given us good things to enjoy here. It doesn't mean we, are not active in trying to promote righteousness in society. Yes, we ought to do all of that. It doesn't mean we don't fight sin. It doesn't mean that we don't cry and weep and grieve when we go through pain. Yes, but ultimately we are longing for a city whose builder and foundation is God, right? We find in Hebrews chapter 12. And sometimes that's why God puts pain in our lives, and we need to interpret it that way. We go through some painful experience, we feel pain ourselves physically, our bodies start to creak and ache, You know, what's one of the things that we ought to be thinking about in our minds when that happens? Boy, I'm longing for the day when I will be in my homeland, be in the land of my kindred, be in the presence of God, right? That is my ultimate home. And that is what finally Rebecca and Leah are forced to feel. It's what Jacob feels. We need to go back. And remember, he's going back to some uncertainty, but he wants to go back nevertheless. And it's what we ought to feel. It's what we ought to have confidence in as well. And then finally, the other lesson we can learn from this is that God will accomplish his purposes with or without us. And we don't need to step in and try to manipulate things. That was Jacob's natural inclination when he deceived Esau and when he deceived his father. But now he has been taught the lesson that God, look at all this wealth, and he's learned it to such a degree that he's able to communicate it to his wives. Look at all this wealth, and I didn't do this. I didn't manipulate things in order for this to happen. This clearly was a work of God. And of course, this needs to be true in our own lives as well. We need to simply obey God. We need to be faithful and not try to take matters into our own hands or manipulate things, knowing that God will indeed keep his promises to us. We simply need to believe them by faith and have confidence that he will. Let's pray together. Father, we're grateful for the lessons from this text, and I pray that we would apply them, that when we experience pain ourselves, when things are going bad around us in the culture, in society, within our own church sometimes, or our own families, that we will learn the lessons that you have for us through that, and that one of those lessons will be a recognition and a reminder that this world is not our home, that we ought not get too comfortable in this present world, but we long for life with you. We long for the land of our fathers, the land of our Christian fathers. We long for that day. We ask that that day will come quickly. But in the meantime, help us to be faithful. Help us to trust you. Help us to be confident in your promises, not taking matters into our own hands, but recognizing that you will be with us and that you will accomplish that promise, whether or not we understand how you're, and we trust you.